humans here, and we want to use that proactively to put listening devices or Internet of Things or phones control over eavesdropping back into the user's hands. So first of all, I kind of want to make the point that the scale of voice-activated systems is now vast. In 2024, there are 8.4 billion devices. Voice-activated devices outnumber the number of people. And this smart tech is really omnipresent, even if you're on the move or in your car. Listening mics are there in phones, homes, autos. And essentially the purpose of these is for our convenience as personal assistants. When you look at the major tech vendors, whether it's Google, Apple, Microsoft, or Amazon, each one of these have a very large presence within the voice-activated system community. And finally, once you go into, say, a smartphone, there is a huge listening surface even within that one device. So just the fact that there are 8 billion devices does not really narrow it down, because there's much more opportunity once you're inside the device. I'll show later a typical iPhone may have 20 or more apps, including custom apps from potential malicious actors. Now, given that wide attack surface, or if you will, convenience, there's surprisingly limited attention to the basic security. And that's really a convenience issue that these vendors have chosen. But for example, the wake word is typically not biometric. There is no voice print, except potentially for some later stage iPhones. It's not recognizing your voice, it's just recognizing a wake word. Secondly, really that wake word, if you think of Echo or Alexa or Hey Google or Hey Siri, each one of those is essentially a universal password, which we think about the connectedness of these devices, the fact that they randomly connect to Wi-Fi in restaurants or coffee shops, the fact that they can be Bluetooth. The idea that that wake word is a universal password is somewhat unacceptable in a networked environment. Finally, we will show you that inadvertent recordings are pretty significant. Empirically, on an Amazon Echo, up to 50% of all recordings are not intended for the device. So that means someone has said a word similar to the wake word. The device assumes that that was not intended for it, but it will still hold the recording. And then finally, you have to imagine secondary downstream consequences, which is, if that is a listening device, what can you do with it? And most of those voice-activated systems are actually what you would call transactional, meaning you can do finance, travel, there's personal identifying information, there's health information, and they certainly have sub-apps or applications that can link to other platforms like banking. So it is a large-scale voice-activated system as an attack surface. So it turns out there's a long history of essentially hijacking these voice-activated systems without the user's knowledge. If you go back to 2017, there was a large commercial in which on the television broadcast to millions of households, OK Google was spoken, and every device in all of those households was awakened to essentially feed a sub-commercial without the user's intent. Subsequently, people have begun to attack the microphone-specific physics. So if you look at these microphones, I mentioned earlier, they do not hear the same way that we do. So for example, they have a much higher fidelity at high frequencies, where past the age of, say, 15 or 16, a human cannot hear above 18 kilohertz. These microphones can hear all the way from 18 to 22 kilohertz. So you can think of it as like a dog whistle or a bat or a dolphin, some high frequency sound. And so people have found you can issue commands to these devices and make calls or visit websites and the user is unaware that that command is being issued because it's not audible to them. So 2018, there was a thing called a dolphin attack, which is sort of a beam-forming ultrasonic transducers. These are basically horn tweeters that can send commands. When the microphone, depending on how you craft the attack, the microphone effectively will downshift it into the audible when it's received, and it will act upon it. Typically, these are near-term attacks, say within the first foot. So you have to be near the device. But subsequently, people have found ways to concentrate the audible energy. And so you have a number of attacks later on, essentially, that magnify the intensity. Well, along comes machine learning, and of course, then you have voice clones, which can not only interact with the device, but actually interact downstream. So there's a number of banking apps that are now subject to voice clones. And we actually were awarded in the United States, an entry for the National Vulnerability Database, which essentially shows all of the things you can do with this sort of attack. So this would generally paint a picture over the last, say, 8 or 10 years of a pretty concerted attack on microphones. The converse, which is really the subject of this talk, is how do we turn that to a defense? In other words, if these microphones are sensitive at high frequency, can we send jamming signals and essentially prevent microphones from inadvertent listening? So that's the problem statement. Can users deactivate on command voice-activated systems by themselves? So essentially think of it as a jammer. And the purpose of this jammer would be to allow the user to assert their own privacy and security. So there's a number of ways you could deactivate or minimize the listening or eavesdropping of these devices. You can use acoustic shielding. You can use frequency filtering. Obviously, it's subject to machine learning, so adaptive learning, for example, filtering certain types of noise like white noise or blue noise. User authentication, obviously the wake word itself is really the culprit here. And then finally, assure, since we're talking largely about Internet of Things, a lot of these are not available for security updates, just like people don't typically change the password on a thermostat. It's also very difficult to put in these kinds of security updates, which opens them up to, over time, legacy attacks. So I mentioned the scope of this is rather large, but I want to kind of dig in. This is just alone. These are the logos from automobiles that have voice-activated systems. You can turn off the car. You can turn on the car. You can unlock it. You can adjust the mirrors all by voice. And we've shown that you can essentially adjust that without the user's knowledge. Teleconferencing apps have blown up, including this one. So Zoom and Teams can have microphones that can inadvertently introduce noise or inadvertent commands. The smart home market, the wearable market, and finally, really the intention of most of these voice-activated workflows is the personal assistant. So this is kind of just a graphical way of showing the modern home, or potentially the future home. And this is a burgeoning field which combines machine learning with what we would call acoustic cybersecurity. Just like we have network cybersecurity, there are all these interfaces which are potentially open, and we would like to put them more in the user's control. So the background here, this is a teardown of a particular Amazon Echo. These little gold bars are 7 distributed microphones. Each one of these microphones, which would be categorized as a MEMS, will listen at high frequency and downshift it into audible, which means you can issue commands, but that also means we can issue jamming signals at high frequencies, which won't interfere with the conversation, but actually would prevent it from being recorded. So essentially, we want to prevent either the on-device wake word, so wake up Alexa, could be jammed, or you can do specialized signal processing for beamforming to cover, for example, an entire room. So this is kind of a visualization of what we're talking about, where we want to turn the vulnerability of these microphones to privacy protection. I mentioned that you would issue a command. So for example, this would be the spectrogram of, hey, Alexa, open Citibank, and open my bank account. And you can shape that command at high frequency such that the microphone will downshift it. And when it appears on the Amazon server, it very much mimics, this is all this part here is the broadcast. and this is the origin, and this is what the server hears. So very similar command once the high frequency command is downshifted by the microphone. And that was really the basis of our vulnerability or zero-day attack. This is kind of the way it looks dynamically. This is where a human would hear in this first orange box. This is where the command is being issued. In this case, we're sweeping at high frequency, and you see the same essential fingerprint at high frequency, which is inaudible, appears on the server issuing commands. So if you imagine now we're going to take this inaudible frequency and issue it as noise, then what you hear on the server should be masked, which means that you have ensured privacy and you have essentially turned a microphone that does not hear like a human into something that at least covers the background conversation. So that was the basis of the experiment. Sorry, looks like I'm, excuse me. So let me give a concrete example in this video. We are actually issuing a command to this echo, and this echo is tied to this vacuum cleaner. And this is entirely inaudible to anyone in the room. And in fact, could be done over a YouTube video or a Teams meeting, and essentially issue random commands and act on the physical world. All right, so this is our experimental setup. We want to validate that we can jam that sort of attack. And the basic idea is we will issue wake commands, but at the same time, we will issue a 60 decibel white noise, which is inaudible. This is the device we're trying to protect, and here's the human who wants to cover the conversation. So we want to test this over various distances. As I mentioned before, high frequency noise doesn't necessarily transfer over long distances. So we looked at 1 feet, 3 feet, and 6 feet at 60 decibels. So the idea is eventually you would just hear white noise and static on the user side. So this is what it looks like in spectrograms. We're issuing the command in addition to noise in the B case. In the A case, we just issue the command and register whether it works at various distances. So we're going to ask these devices, any one of these voice-activated devices, play an audiobook on Audible. And this would be what it looks like, the spectrogram of the good command and the clean command at 1, 3, and 6 feet, very similar. And then when we overlay that audible command with inaudible noise, then you see this sort of static mask. And in fact, we will eventually score this command as to whether A, the device acknowledges the wake word, or B, whether it actually acts on it as a useful command. We did the same thing for many more commands. In this case, we're going to act on an Internet of Things target. So we ask a connected device, set the thermostat to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be a pretty high air conditioning load in Fahrenheit. And again, at 1, 3, and 6 feet, that command will go through pretty clearly when we overlay near ultrasonic noise, which is in that magic 18 to 22 kilohertz range, which the microphone hears, but the human doesn't. Then you hear this static on the server. So this is kind of the scorecard. We wanted to really divide the problem into two areas. First, we wanted to look at the distance dependence. Then we wanted to look at the complexity of the command. So some of these might have a higher demand to interpret them. So search for the film Shawshank Redemption might be considered a more data-intensive command as opposed to what's the weather. And then we also wanted to have a manual trigger. So the wake word would be always done in sort of clear without noise, and then you would turn on the noise to mask the command. So that guarantees that you're not just you've really put it in the user's command. So roughly speaking, about 60 to 70% of the time, at all distances, you will get interference. So you do effectively have, as a scorecard, an effective jamming potential without interfering with the conversation. You can also, the third thing we wanted to look at is, can we look at different kinds of noise? White noise, particularly in an automobile, is often very easy to filter because the assumption is that device is always having background noise of engine roar. So white noise is sort of random. We want to look at the comparison of the word error rate. So you issue a command, and then you listen on the server and reverse engineer that, and you look at how many words were garbled. Across white or pink or brown noise, each one of them has their own intensity in terms of mainly the spikiness of the intensity. It turns out white noise in this case was effective to about 50%. Word error rate, which effectively means I issue the command, what's the weather? And it comes back as give me a handle or some sort of garbled response. That would be a measure of the word error rate. So there is a lot of previous work, including from us, both on the attack side and the defense side. I think the most interesting part of this genre is really just how this could be exploited for critical infrastructure. So I mentioned banking, but also utilities. There's actually 16 or so Internet of Things that connect to, for example, pipelines or electric grids or vehicle navigation. But anyway, it is considered critical infrastructure, which you would want to be safeguarded. And then you have the notion of a truly determined malicious attacker who would, for example, want to access your bank account without you knowing it. So those are kind of the results in the experimental setup. The purpose of this really is to establish privacy in a user-enabled way, a very dynamic way. So you can imagine law firms, board meetings in which a merger might be discussed, medical consultation where there's privacy around health information, or just generally car conversations. There are actually legal privacy requirements for recording minors without their permission. And Amazon particularly lost a class action suit in November, which means they have to give the opportunity for these devices to filter in the home. If you have children in the home without any voice print, there's a high likelihood that they are recording minors. And secondly, and lastly, I guess there is this whole genre of what you could call second order interactions, such as access my calendar, access my contacts, add a calendar contact, delete a meeting, issue spam through my message app, or of course, banking. This is a survey of how these devices are used. Typically, these are used for asking a question. It's somewhat frustrating to the vendors because I think the vendors, particularly Amazon, imagine people would be buying things through them, and they're generally using it as a search surrogate. But there is about 10% of the daily use, which is what you could call highly interactive or second order, like call someone, control a smart home device, access my calendar, or potentially spam someone. So when you consider the attack surface of 8 billion devices, even the small green area here of 10% using it daily is still hundreds of millions that might want to enforce their own privacy. The second, really, which is, I mentioned unintended recording. This is over a 3-hour span from 6 p.m. to about 8:30. And Alexa typically listening, and 1, 2, 3 out of the 5 are registered audio is not intended for Alexa. So it hears the wake word, and then it decides later that sends my recording to the server, and then it assumes that's not intended for it. So this could be a minor. It could be a reason to enforce these blocks. This is also typically, if you go to an iPhone, you have the option to turn off which apps can be listening. There are about 20 apps that have this option. So I could, for example, I could ask for location information covertly. I could act on ChatGPT on the voice. Typically, these teleconferencing apps like Teams or Zoom are default listening apps, and so I could broadcast to an entire group in either a spam message or something that would appear in the transcript that would be potentially implicating, for example, insulting the boss. And then there are things that like voice command apps for a browser. So Safari on an iPhone is almost always default. So once you get beyond the wall of the 8 billion devices, you go deeper into the 20 or so applications, which really makes it about 160 billion as far as attack surfaces. Finally, there are risk and misuse potential. We kind of mentioned what's available to the attacker is potentially useful to the defender. So it's a dual use jam. I can send coherent commands, or I can send incoherent cover to safeguard privacy. Really, I think the big issue is you're in a tug of war. The race, like a lot of the internet, you have a race between privacy protection and data rights. And finally, you have these opportunities to interfere with emergency responders, military operations, or other critical infrastructure. So in summary, we want to enable trustworthy voice control. The unique element, the sort of attractive element of this project was to transform what otherwise is a built-in vulnerability. There's no real patch for these hardware microphones in the near ultrasound frequencies, but there is an opportunity to proactively turn that exploit into a powerful privacy protection tool. We have shown that it is capable of defending against inadvertent or overt reasons for listening, and it does not necessarily have to disrupt the authorized audio of the conversation. With that, in other words, it does not have to disturb the human occupant, like say a sleep machine or a general white noise machine. And we do see wide-ranging applications at the personal or the corporate or public use case. And it does potentially, you could deploy it through an app, for example, launch my cone of silence as a looping MP3, or you could have a hardware broadcaster that is always broadcasting in this jamming sense. There are some limitations to this approach. The key factors for success are how you shape the noise, how you choose to broadcast it. So, for example, I mentioned on hardware or software, the intensity and the spatial arrangement. There's good reasons to think white noise is not the perfect